Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast where cross-cultural workers discuss everything from faith and fear to finances and faux pas. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauli, missions leader serving here in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo. He's back, our church planter in Cisterna di Latina, and Jenn Williamson, our missiologist, who lives and works in Lyon. Welcome back, Alessandro. Hello, Jenn.
Good to be back.
Hi, guys.
We're finally back. We're excited to have Alessandro back. We recorded a couple episodes without him, and then now he's able to connect. Even though he's still not home, he's able to connect with us for these next episodes. So we're going to jump right into it. I think it's a pretty cool segue because we are all connected recording this. We're using a platform called Riverside, which allows us to be in 3 separate locations. Right now, Alessandro's even in a whole nother continent, and we're able to record this, which is kind of part of what we want to talk about today. As you guys know, we've been working through different aspects of Jenn's dissertation and talking about doing missions with. And today we're going to talk about specifically how well we're connected in this world and what impact does that have. In fact, I think we titled this one Global Connectivity, Friend or Foe. So let's start off by just asking the question, how are we all connected to our sending country? Like, how often are we in communication with our friends and family and people back in our sending country? So I think we're all sent from the U.S. Jenn, how often are you in contact, do you think, with people back in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, it's been different through different seasons. So we've been in France for 14 years. So there's been definitely, ebbs and flows. Currently, I have a weekly call with one of my sisters who lives in the US and a weekly scheduled call with one of my best friends who lives in the States. So that's my friends and family contact. But there's a lot of other ways that it's easy to stay connected. So like we watch Netflix. Now I often will watch French shows on Netflix. So that doesn't necessarily, so everything I watch on Netflix isn't necessarily American sourced or American based.
The question is, are you able
yeah.
to watch like Hollywood produced films in French, or do you watch them in English? And not are you
So
able, but do you, I guess?
Our rule is we watch it in the language it was made in. So if I'm watching a French movie, I want to watch it in French. And if I'm watching a US movie, I want to watch it in what the French call version originale in English.
Yes.
So yeah, no, we'll watch French movies in French or French TV in French and American movies in English. And then I also really like K-dramas. So I watch Korean dramas with usually English subtitles.
Cool. What about you, Alessandro?
You said usually, Jenn. Does that mean there are times you watch Korean drama in Korean?
I definitely don't watch it in Korean. There have been places where the only option is French subtitles, so I can watch K-dramas with French subtitles too. Yeah.
I was trying to understand what you meant by sometimes. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, do you know Korean?
No.
So how connected I am? I think also like Jenn, there were seasons. I've been in Italy for 5 years. I think at the beginning you tend to be a little bit more connected just because your connections in Italy or wherever you are less, and so I was more connected. But for the most part, uh, there's some people I text almost every day, but just for fun, like friendships that I kept in touch with. Nothing necessarily deep. As far as TV, I'm the same as Jenn. I even when I was in the States, I was watching all sorts of things. I like things from different countries, and so I also have that rule where whatever language it was produced, I'm watching in that with subs, obviously. And as far as news and everything, I always try to get a worldview look into what's happening in the world. So nothing necessarily that has kept me uh, specifically tied to the US. What I was doing already in the US, I kind of brought here, but it was already kind of looking outwards
Yeah.
already. Like even the
Mm-hmm.
food that I
Oh,
eat,
that's good.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to cook my own food, so I was always eating cross cultural food, and I brought that here. So maybe
Yeah.
things have slightly changed.
Oh man, you guys are so much better than I am at this. I was like thinking through this as we were kind of in preparation. I'm like, okay, I don't have a lot of phone calls except for like work phone calls with people that are in the States, but like I don't we do like a on my wife's side we do a family call once a month and stuff like that because we're spread around the
Mm-hmm.
world as well. Her other brothers um in East Asia. And so anyway, so we have to do kind of organize the calls, but I do text often like family and stuff. But man, I for some reason I find it really hard to not get like my media source from the US. So I like podcasts that I listen to, TV shows. Although right now I'm
Mm.
not watching a lot of TV and movies, but a lot of podcasts, a lot of YouTube families or YouTubers that I follow are mostly based out of the US. And so yeah, I'm not very good at this whole assimilating, I guess, into the local. I've tried with the news a little bit to watch like a variety, kind of like what you're saying, Alessandro. So I've done stuff where I'll watch Sky News, but I watch in English, and then I'll watch like Al Jazeera in English to kind of get two different perspectives and world
Yeah.
views on stuff. But um,
I actually prefer either BBC or French news
you
or
mean you
even
don't
Al
watch like
Jazeera.
CNN or Fox regularly, like part of your
I
daily
really don't.
ritual?
It's really hard for me when I'm in the US to watch it because it doesn't feel like news anymore.
Yeah.
It feels like opinions.
Um. Okay, we won't digress into that rabbit trail, but
No, let's don't.
The um the interesting one of the things I thought were really interesting has been the idea of like um books, in particular the Bible. What about that? How does that look for you guys? Like I've found myself even this couple weeks I've been preparing sermons as I'm pulpit filling for Sandro while he travels, and it's like I've been doing it mostly in English and then translating into Italian. I've kind of been catching myself saying, "Man, I need to do it into Italian and directly." And so, what about you guys? What are you? How does that look like for you?
I really hate translating. So if I'm preparing a message or a sermon in French, I do everything in French. I do the Bible, I do my Bible study in French for it. I do my sermon prep for it. For years and years and years, I had also, I would have someone double check that. I would have a French native speaker even help me correct and read through my French. But I just don't like translating. Translating is really hard for
Mm,
me. So I'd rather do it all in French. I read my Bible in, yeah, both languages. I can pretty much pick up whichever one I want. I like the nuances. I like the difference.
hmm
But like I'm in a growth group with people from my church. And so whatever we've chosen to read for our growth group, I tend to read in French because I know I'm going to be discussing it in French
Yeah.
and it just puts the language in my head in French. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it really. I mean, you obviously have to be fluent to some degree in that language. Let's pick let's as you mentioned, Jesse, the Bible. Like we all need to be reading the Bible for our spiritual growth. And so if you're just picking up Korean to go back to that language, and you're like where there's different characters, if that's what you call them, forgive me if I'm wrong in that area, I'm not an expert in Korean, and you're like, I need to become acquainted with the language as fast as possible, and you're neglecting your spiritual feeding if you're trying to read something you really can't make sense of it. But definitely after coming to a certain level of language acquisition, then you should, I think, you should dive into that language. Like I do everything in Italian because I could, for the most part, understand it really well. And I actually find it more difficult when you, because if your main language, if your mother tongue is in our case English, and you write a sermon in English, you're doing everything in English, and then you translate it, and then you're trying to do it in that language, like in our case Italian. I actually find it difficult. So if I'm thinking and starting in Italian, because it's my lesser language, it actually comes out easier when I'm preaching it. So it's kind of a lot of more work at the beginning, but then easier in the preaching aspect, as opposed to maybe easier to put it together and then having a hard time. So I've learned probably 3 years in, 2 years in, that I need to do everything in Italian. I need to think in Italian, do it straight up in Italian, which helps me then when I'm preaching.
That's great. So we kind of digressed onto the language for a minute, but the idea of this connectivity and how easily we can, get access information from our, from our countries of origin is so different than before. Like years, you always talk about like, oh, they packed their coffins and they went overseas, and the idea was like you weren't going back. You weren't. I mean, their internet wasn't even there, so there wasn't the access to people. I mean, even remember as a kid when we moved to Europe, we had to buy phone cards, and you only had so many hours, and the phone, wasn't wireless. So like, if you were using the phone, you were tying up the internet, all that kind of stuff in the early 2000s, and um, I guess the question or kind of the direction we want to go today is like, what impact is this having on missionaries and our adjustment to our new places of um, dwelling, our new homes? What impact does it have for culture shock? What are your guys' thoughts? What
Mhm.
have you seen?
I think the impact that it's having, given that is this word global, it's having an impact globally, not just in the sense of worldly going to the world, but also in every aspect, in every area. So yes, it's impacting how missions is being done, but so is literally everything else. And so I didn't live, as you were mentioning about in the 1900s where they were going out and not coming back. Uh, whether I'm a missionary or going for a work purpose, the world is living in this idea where you can come back, you could leave, you can connect back home. So the impact, I guess, just to start off, is it's not necessarily different for a missionary. It might have differences, but it's not necessarily different from everything else that's happening in the world.
So, I read an article about this. It was a long time ago in Christianity Today that talked about how it might be a hindrance, that this idea of this global connectivity, the fact that it's so easy to kind of keep one foot in the sending country and one foot in the host country. The article was called Netflix is Making It Harder to Be a Missionary. And and the author there, she really thought that it contributes like to prolonged culture shock. So while I agree, Alessandro, it doesn't matter if you're a missionary or a business person or whatever, of course it's going to impact you. Um, I wonder as missionaries, since the call is really to be incarnate, to be a living being, representative ambassador for Christ in this new place, this idea of connecting with that culture is significant and important. And culture shock is real. It's a real struggle. I remember our mission organization recommended when we launched 14 years ago. I don't know if they still make this recommendation, but they said for 1 year, do not return to your sending country and no one can visit you from your sending country. And this was really kind of to cut the apron strings and to say, like, you're here now. Like, you need to be here now. You need to build your life here now. And you need to, figure out how you're going to get rooted here, build your social network here, build your support system here, figure out, from the most basic things. I take a regular prescription that I'm going to have to take for my whole life. And when I moved here, one of the first things I had to do was find a doctor so I could make sure that I could still get that prescription, because I can't be calling my doctor back in the States to do that for me anymore. So there's some things that you're sort of forced into. But I know people who still buy their clothes in the States. In fact, that's one of the comments I got from some interviews that I did with French partners when I was trying to kind of evaluate missionary effectiveness during my doctoral work. And they thought it was so funny. They said, I can recognize an American by their shoes. They all still buy their shoes in the States. And I thought that was so funny. And I do know some missionaries who will, or, who will still buy their clothes in the US. That some of that might be practical. I'm more long-waisted than most French women apparently. So sometimes French clothes don't fit me great, but I can buy them in Germany. I mean, I've learned,
Different spots.
which brands work for me here. It just takes time. So it's not just the internet connectivity, it's just this ease of global travel means that, things can keep us from having to find roots here where in the past that it just wasn't possible. That we weren't going to go back and forth 1 or 2 times a year where you could say, "Oh, my jeans are about to, wear out, but I'll just buy my jeans when I get back to the US."
Yeah, I totally agree with the idea that we need to be incarnational. And I think the thing to realize and to be mindful is that it is a choice. It's obviously it's great when it kind of works out where you kind of feel like at home, but it is something that we're making a decision to go. And just speaking, so I think maybe Jesse has a similar, I guess, experience. I come from an immigrant family. We're from Italy. We actually moved to the U.S. And then my mother had to do that from the Philippines to Italy, then to the U.S. And I just remember that, and this is not a Christian move. This was a immigration move
Mhm.
for us to find better place. And we were not, in one sense we were trying to incarnate ourselves so that we can better fit the school system and succeed, but another way we were trying everything we can to make sure we find things Italian, this was
Mhm.
10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so kind of realizing that if you even 100 years ago, when you went somewhere, if you weren't intentionally thinking, I'm going to uh, incarnate myself somewhere, you're going to be looking for home. Today's easier, but it doesn't necessarily means that 100 years ago people were not looking to do that. I think it's always a choice that we have to fight, to
Mm.
say, why did God send me here, and
Mm.
how do I fight against these thoughts, and these ideas and these things that are keeping me from really focusing where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because, yeah, I mean, I know there was, I like you mentioned, I was also a third culture kid and have moved back and forth around, and um, yeah, I would say there's definitely things that I do prefer to hold on to from my American upbringing, and then there's things I try to get rid of as much as I can and embrace of the Italian uh, culture and life. And um, even when I was back in the States recently, I kind of could see those things coming up. Um, but one of the things that they think or that they point to in this is the idea, in this article that Jen mentioned, is this idea of the ease of travel too. So not just the connectivity that we have digitally, but also this idea that, for $700 you can fly from Europe to the US pretty easily. I mean, obviously there are changes based off of the time of year and things, um, but relatively inexpensive travel and quicker than before too. And the impact that has on homesickness and just the desire to go back, or we've recently had some things and we had to weigh those. We had some deaths in the family, some different events, and it's like, okay, do we go back or do we not? And we went back for the deaths, but for example, there's an upcoming family reunion that we probably won't be going back for. A lot of other family is traveling in from all over to go to it, but we won't be making that trip. So I feel like you're forced to make more decisions now, regarding those things than
Yeah.
before. Do you guys find that to be true?
Yeah, and I think expectations are heavier. Like when you miss a family reunion, it feels like you're making a choice not to go to the family reunion and not like you're making a choice to, stay committed where you are and where you need to be doing life and ministry. And so I think it's easier for family to be offended, and also it goes both ways. It's easier for family to come and visit,
Mm,
which on the one hand is great. It's a lot of fun. But we are actually working full-time jobs here, and I think sometimes when people visit, they're on vacation, and so they have this impression that they're gonna come and they have this full-time tour guide for 2 weeks, and so the ease of travel, even my direction, sometimes can be disruptive, and I've had to put in some boundaries and say, "Well, I could do this with you on that day, but then I'll be working for the next 3 days. I can suggest some things for you to do." Like, I am actually working a real job. I'm not just over here touring France.
yeah, we've had that discussion on our field with different people coming. I mean, especially I think when you're in major cities, when you're in, Um, you know, tourism in Rome is crazy, and we've had. I remember our first year on the field, we counted how many people were just traveling, and it was something like 16 different people throughout the year were coming through and had reached out to us. So yeah, it's interesting. Speaking of boundaries, though, oh, go
And
ahead.
well, and it's awful often supporters too. So
Yes,
then there's that delicate line between
yes,
like wanting to be a very kind and generous host to the people that you're supporting and the people that are supporting you and wanting the people that are supporting you to recognize that you actually do have a full-time job and that you're working. And so like there's this dance to do.
that's exactly. I think those are the most difficult ones. I actually find it a little bit easier with people that aren't supporting to be like, yeah, sorry, I have stuff I'm doing, but people are supporting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a much more delicate dance. But anyways, speaking of the boundaries, because you kind of mentioned the boundaries you put in place when people come to visit you. What about like, and this is the thing that I've found difficult. What about personal boundaries when it comes to the use of our phones or our TVs that have connection, via social media or mass media like Netflix and Hulu and all these kind of things. We're not sponsored by any of these people. We should stop saying their name. But anyways, uh, one day maybe. Anyways, yeah, yeah. What kind of boundaries do you guys have? Boundaries that you personally set in place for you or your family, um, or have you heard of any that you think are good and worth trying?
I think so. Boundaries are definitely good for anything, not just the phone. We have fences and we have locks for different reasons, depending where you're living, what you're doing. So they're all in context. I grew up in the south of Italy, in Sicily, and we have regular doors. They remind me of, not necessarily, they don't look like American doors, but they're a little bit more robust as far as the designs and everything, but simple lock. Now I live in by Jesse in Rome. Man, you could not get a tank through these doors. They are armored, and so there's a boundary for a reason, because break-ins are more common, and so I think boundaries are meant to for the purpose of helping you. And so yeah, I hear people putting boundaries, and I think that's great. And I encourage, if that's something really that somebody's struggling with. Personally, I don't have any boundaries with my phone. I think the greatest boundary, or the greatest check that I have, is my wife. If she'll say something that I'm too much on my phone, or vice versa, she does a lot of work in the computer and the phone. I would be that for her. But besides that, we haven't put any like boundaries, and it's worked for us. But that's for us. I know that some people really need it, and so I recommend it if that's something that's going to help you to kind of detach for a little bit.
Yeah. We've also like we have had some boundaries, different ones. I mean, I've even done a media like total fast from social
Mm,
media and from my phone for like a month at a time. Um, just because it's good for me, regardless, having nothing to do with missions, good for me to just kind of take a step back from time to time. But we also put in, I mean, this isn't a boundary, but like we'll say, hey, we're going to watch, especially early on, we're going to watch the French news for 1 hour
it's
every
like a
day.
discipline.
So it's more like incorporating as well. Or like our rule of if the movie or the TV show is made in French, we're going to watch it in French. And if we put on subtitles, they'll be French subtitles, not English subtitles. But usually anymore, we don't use subtitles. But um, so we've set up sort of rules for ourselves in that way that have been, I think, helpful. And I also like in I mean, books are media too, I guess. So I read one French book a month. I read about 3 to 4 books a month, but I make sure that on my reading list and my plan for the year of what I'm going to read and that I am always at least reading one French book a
Hmm.
month. And then all of the news articles that I read in French online. So I make certain portions of my media consumption. Either I make sure that there's room for the French in there or that it's I'm consuming the French perspective.
Yeah, like I said, you guys definitely do way better. I'm feeling very convicted that I need to up my game on this side of things. But one of the things that I've found similar to what you're talking about, Jen, is like at the beginning I would look up the weather in English. I'd look up like recipes in English, and I started finding that it's not as accurate. It's harder to do the conversions. So I started finding. I mean, I don't cook hardly ever, but whenever I do cook, the very few times I do cook, I look up the recipe in Italian so that I'm getting the Celsius. I'm getting all the measurements the same, and I'm seeing how they cook or how they talk about cooking versus. And the same with the weather. I've just learned that like looking it up with the Italian meteorologist and not a global meteorologist or whatever definitely makes a difference. To that effect, though, I guess you kind of hinted at some of them already, Jen. But let's talk a minute because we kind of beaten up enough on the downside of technology and the connectivity. What are some of the benefits? What are some of the things that we can be grateful for?
I mean, I have 2 adult sons who live in the US, so we text almost every day. And I think how hard it must have been from, missionaries in the past when you couldn't just check in on, even though they're adults, on your kids like that. So I'm really deeply grateful. And then I have a husband who also travels for work a lot, and we are able to have regular, lengthy conversations, and stay in touch that way. And that's really helpful. And then I also think about when we do have to go back to the US for furlough or for whatever, we can sometimes join our church in French online. There's ways we can actually stay connected back here when we're there. Like I can still watch my French news. I can still watch my football matches. I can still, do those things when we're in the US.
Yeah, there's definitely so much that is good with the global digital age. That number one thing is the resources that it provides us. I mean, right off the
Mhm.
top of my head, as we were talking about going from one language to another, as much as I try to do everything in the language that I'm working with, which is Italian, I don't use Google Translate. I use this other website, deepl.com, and that's incredible. Like that kind of technology, and it's being able to connect, and not just to the Italian language. We've come across different languages where we get to use it to be able to communicate with other people. That's
Yep.
incredible.
Yep.
That is super incredible. And then of course the resources.
Mhm. Yeah. And if we didn't say something about Bible translation too, like the use of AI in terms of translating the Bible into languages that don't have it has accelerated at a rate that would have formerly been unimaginable.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me one of the interesting things is like we've said, it's a double edged sword. But like if you're using it for the right reasons, you can. I mean, you could basically get a seminary education from
Oh, which I did.
classes
Yeah.
online, from media.
Mhm.
I think it was
Didn't have to leave the field to go back and get my doctorate of
yeah,
ministry because of the possibility of doing remote learn. Yeah.
exactly. Even I think like even for people who aren't in proper degree programs or doctoral programs, there's so much access to lectures and things that are just available in podcast form or YouTube videos or so forth. Um, I think one of the popular ones is like Right Now Media. You can get tons of stuff through that platform, and um, so yeah, so there's so much going on, and as we discussed in the Lausanne report, um, they asked the question, what is a digital age, and this lends the things that we discussed today are relevant to that kind of idea of what's going on in the Great Commission and what's the impact of this digital age on the Great Commission. So I guess to kind of conclude us in wrapping up this talk, which all of these things are just snippets. These are hopefully spurring on conversation amongst those that listen, because there's a lot more to think and talk about in this. It's not comprehensive. Um, but what are some kind of concluding thoughts on the digital age, the connectivity that we have, and yeah, the expansion of God's kingdom, the expansion of the great commandment, or Sorry, not the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, to go forward to all the nations. What do you guys think?
I just to end would want to note the fact that about 2 years ago we had a thing called the pandemic, and it would have been totally different if we were not as connected as we are today. And I think it made us realize a lot of things, good and bad. And so, just to not to dive in any longer, but just to kind of realize, um, we realized that there was a lot of good in the digital age, or the tools that God has allowed us to have in this season, in this time, in this generation, so that we could have done things that we never thought we would ever do. Church online, discipleship online, and things that now maybe we're still doing because it made sense and it makes sense to our context. Maybe we would think as unholy before, but now because we were kind of forced to do it and it worked and people were coming to know the Lord and we're growing in Christ, we are given the green light to keep going.
Yeah, like you said, Jesse, it's that double-edged sword. It's just like money. Technology is neither good nor evil. It's what you do with it that counts. And I think um, being self-aware about, am I using this or is it owning me? Um, is this, a resource that I'm using, or am I completely, taken over by it? Being self-aware matters. And then I think, yeah, God put us in this age. There's nothing that we're experiencing or living that God didn't know would be part of what's going on. So God has a plan for the digital age and for the kingdom in the digital age and what that looks like. So being self-aware and God aware, I think, will help us.
That is very good. And with that, with the idea that we are in a digital age and we have new terminology, I think, new vocabulary, new things to think about as a result. And a few of those words are things like, share, subscribe. So I want to take that opportunity to encourage all of our listeners to go ahead and share this, send it to people that you think might be encouraged, might be interested in listening to it. And yeah, especially if you're on Spotify, if you're listening to us on Spotify, please go on, leave a comment, and you can even leave a little voice message and ask a question or share a thought. And we would love to be able to include those as part of our podcast. But until next time, thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to getting to share more about what it looks like to do missions with as we go throughout this season.